Hey, what's up, guys? I know that there are a number of you who have been watching this channel a little bit who may not be fully familiar with the idea behind these baseball simulation engines, and in particular with the idea of doing season replays. And you're probably wondering what in the world is going on and why in the world would anybody want to waste their time on such a silly and useless activity. It's actually a lot of fun, to be honest with you, and it's the sort of game that I would put up there with things like hobbyist wargaming and other little pastimes like that are somewhat geeky and nerdy in nature. So if you don't really know or understand exactly where this comes from, the idea behind playing season replays, replaying a past Major League Baseball season, or even coming up with a project of your own, mostly comes from the board game world. And it mostly comes from the period of time in the 1940s and 1950s when this sort of thing became popular and actually possible, right? So I've mentioned this before on this channel. The very beginning of it goes back to this game called National Pastime that was released in 1930, very late 1930, by a guy named Clifford Van Beek. The game didn't sell very well. Unfortunately for him, he went out of business about a year and a half later when his printer sued him for money that he was owed. Van Beek's game was, as far as I can tell, the first game to have ratings for individual players and to make it so that a player would more or less perform the way that he did in real life, within the realm of statistical possibility. But the vast majority of people who play these games did not start playing National Pastime in 1930. Like, nobody played it, with one exception. Now, these games really sort of come around in the 40s with Ethan Allen's All-Star Baseball. You may know this if you're of a certain generation. It's the game with the spinners, where instead of rolling dice, you have a spinner, but it will give you statistics over time that are realistic and is a good simulation of baseball, and then followed eventually by APBA in 1951. APBA is the reason why National Pastime, we even know about it, because J. Richard Seitz, who created APBA, used National Pastime sort of as the model, created a number of innovations and a few minor changes, and marketed it as his own game. And it's largely based on APBA that this sort of industry took off. APBA was eventually followed by Strat-O-Matic and by a number of other games in the 60s, Strat-O-Matic being the most well-known and the most famous of them. Eventually this sort of like cottage industry that at one point in time probably had around 100,000 or so guys interested in it was developed. The idea behind it basically is that you can take a player's real-life statistics, reduce it to, a series of numbers, a series of statistics, a series of symbols or whatever, and then use some sort of engine, usually dice, to come up with some kind of result in each individual game. Baseball lends itself very, very well to this type of game, better than any other sport. And the reason why is because baseball is very, very predictable, and baseball is broken down into plate appearances, right, which are really, really easy to model. It's easy to get the statistics, more or less. It wasn't as easy, I think, for Clifford Van Beek as some of us would pretend, but especially these days, it's very easy to get the statistics, and it's easy to sort of break things down from one plate appearance to the next and see what happens. This is as opposed to games like hockey or basketball, in which people have tried to do similar things, but will have problems with flow, right? No matter how cool you make your basketball game with fast action cards, it's always going to feel a little bit choppy and a little bit jittery compared to the real action, because you can't have the dice or the cards or even your fast action cards are not going to run back and forth up and down the court. All that's got to happen up in your head, right? I think the closest thing you've got to a game that's comparable to baseball would be football in this sense. And football is nice, but it has its own type of problems, because if you try to play single player against yourself, you're going to know as the defensive coach what the offense has called. And so it becomes really difficult to figure out how to make it so that you have some sort of realistic result and realistic defense, despite the fact that you know exactly what it is you're going to do. Baseball is different, right? This is one of the reasons why when I play Skeeter Soft, I really like playing with automatic base stealing on, if I try to do that with Dynamite Baseball, and if I controlled both, pickoff plays and stealing, I could, pick myself off when I knew I was going to steal. I mean, it gets to the point where it like doesn't make any sense, right? So you don't want to do that. You want to make sure that you make it as fair as possible. But the big question here is not so much about the mechanics, what works and what doesn't, as much as the bigger why question. Like, why do this? What's the point? Why? Who cares? Why not just watch the game? You want to watch an old game? Why not just go watch an old game? And I think above all else, the real attraction here is the fact that when you play a season, when you play through these games, you really don't know what's going to happen. And while you might have an idea of which team will win, which team will lose, the truth is that no two replays are alike, and you're going to get weird results. You're going to have bizarre things happen when you play through each game, and you're going to wind up with things that have taken place, or things that happen in your replay that might not have happened in real life, right? We just saw that in 1908, right? In this game this morning, the Pirates lost their fourth straight in a row. Spoiler alert, and they lost it to the last place Reds, who have now won 4 in a row after going 2-14 to start off the season, right? That's actually really cool. It's a pretty interesting thing to notice, and it makes you think, boy, when you play these games over and over again, you start getting into it, you start thinking of yourself as actually part of the replay and thinking, well, I want to go and I want to see what's going to happen today, what's going to take place in this game, right? These games, when played at their best, will offer a little bit of strategy, and there's a little bit of impact that you can have, but not necessarily too much, right? I don't know of any game, really including even any arcade baseball game, that will give you the ability to say, okay, I want to train my players to hit for contact instead of trying to hit for, a launch angle, and see if I can cut down on their strikeouts, right? And see what impact that's going to have, right? I mean, there's no way that's going to be too difficult to really measure and to play around with in this type of game, right? I mean, that's probably a little bit too in the weeds for the sort of game that we want. Or I'm going to teach this pitcher how to throw, a split finger fastball, and see if that makes any sort of difference. Or I'm going to let this guy, secretly figure out how to throw a scuffed ball. He's going to throw whatever. He's going to throw a shine ball, we're going to figure out a way to do this so the umpire doesn't know. I mean, you can't do that in these games. It's just not the way that it's going to work, right? But that's really what the appeal of these games is that the players will play the way that they played in real life, according to real life statistics and according to whatever engine it is that you're using. And you can therefore expect that at the end of the year, you're going to see statistics that are going to be very similar to how the player performed in real life. Now, there are things in each game engine that can skew that, right? Some games are simple, right? We play Skatersoft NP3, that's a simple game. We're not going to have to worry about stuff that could really skew the statistics, right? We could redraft the players, come up with new teams, have them play on the moon, and they're going to still have the same type of statistics as long as you're playing the players together, and as long as you're not overplaying a guy who had one plate appearance or whatever, or underplaying a guy who had 700 plate appearances and you only gave him 20 or something like that. Overall, for the most part, it's going to come out realistic. And that's interesting because you can say, well, what if we took these two good players and put them together on this team and made that team a lot worse as a result? Would things skew? Would things change, right? You can even do that across eras, right, with this type of game. What if I took Babe Ruth from 1927, combined him with Roger Maris from 1961, and then, Barry Bonds from 2001, and that's going to be our outfield, for choose an awful team for this year's Oakland Athletics, right? What kind of impact would that have, right? You can use these types of games and you can do that sort of counterfactual thing. You can have some fun with it. Maybe it's not going to be scientifically accurate, right? Maybe if you publish it some, saber, nerd is going to come over and say, well, actually that is wrong and this is wrong or whatever. But who cares, right? It's fun. It's supposed to be a fun thing that we do to sort of see what would happen and to come up with this sort of imaginary reality, right? That is still somewhere within the realm of realism. When I was a kid, over on the old NES, I had a game called Legends of the Diamond that was created by LGN. I know, if you're like me, you watched a lot of Angry Video Game Nerd, you're like, oh man, LGN, But Legends of the Diamond was cool because you could take old players and put them in together, but after playing the game like 4 or 5 times, I was like, this sucks because the players don't really play like themselves, and once I figure out, the pitching system or whatever, I can get everybody to hit home runs, and then like, what's the point, right? And you go back to RBI baseball, or if you're like me, you go back to playing APBA in your room because you're like, these NES games are garbage, right? I didn't have baseball stores back then, so if I had baseball stores, maybe I would have stuck with that. But I digress, right? That's sort of the idea behind this game, is that guys are going to play the way that they would play in real life. Now, like I said, there are games like Diamond Mine that offer park effects, that have era effects built in and other things. And so in Diamond Mine, if we're going to take, 1961 Roger Maris and stick him on this year's Oakland Athletics, he's going to hit a number of home runs. That gets into the weeds of how the game is created, but it's going to be different depending upon the ballpark effect, depending upon, how his statistics are translating, through the algorithm and stuff like that, right? So he's not going to be exactly the same player. Whereas with Skeetersoft, if we just took that card, put him into the different era and said, okay, let's see what happens, he'll probably hit 60 home runs, right? No matter what era you put him in. So it gives you kind of an idea of what's going on. There are a lot of questions that come up as a result of this, a lot of questions about cross-era comparison, a lot of questions that are very fundamental about whether baseball has become better or has become worse over time or has stayed relatively the same. I'll give you the answer to that one. I've written a couple blog posts about that. Haven't really gotten around to the sort of deeper level that I was kind of hoping to because of time constraints. But in my opinion, I think that baseball talent is probably roughly the same as it's always been. I have a hard time seeing it becoming extraordinarily better, and I really have a hard time seeing it becoming worse over time. I honestly think that more or less it's about the same. When I hear things about, if you look at, the difference between the best and worst offensive players and blah, 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 I don't really see the major difference that people keep telling me is there. We can talk about that, a different time. However, I will tell you that when it comes to these simulations and it comes to these games, you do kind of have to, at some point in time, expect and take for granted that players are very similar across eras to allow there to be cross-era play and to allow the thing to become interesting. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. No offense, right? But people who come on to message boards and who say like ridiculous things like Babe Ruth was a slap hitter who would never hit in the modern age, couldn't hit in JV or whatever, famous troll arguments like that. Like the people who are saying things like that and who actually believe it are people who've never really studied the history of the sport. You spend time studying the history of the sport, you'll realize that like that's really not true, and that a lot of the innovations that we have today, innovative ways of looking at offense, are things that people actually had thought of and tried in the past and didn't work so well back then. Hence my skepticism. So the nice thing I will say about these simulators is that it gives you a chance to really dive into baseball history. It gives you a really, really good excuse to do that, right? Because if you're a normal baseball historian, you're not going to pay attention to Charlie Starr's 3 games for the Pirates when Honus Wagner was fake retired in 1908, right? If you're a baseball card collector, you might know that there is a Charlie Starr baseball card in the T206 set, right? But even then, I mean, he's a common. You could probably buy him for like a couple bucks on eBay. I don't know. I don't collect anymore. I just like to read what guys who do collect say, right? But if you're playing a replay, if you're playing these simulation games, but not just playing a few games, if you're going to the point where you're like, I'm going to play every game for this season, and I'm going to see what happens the second time around, and I'm going to make whatever change I'm going to make, but we're going to try to make it as realistic as we can, sort of like my 1908 replay, then you're going to realize that somebody has to play shortstop, and it's Charlie Starr. And you become curious, and you're like, well, who is this guy, right? Who is this guy who played for the Pirates and then I can't remember. Didn't he play in the Federal League or something like that afterwards? Like this guy who's just like completely, nobody knows about him historically. And that's when the game starts becoming really, really interesting, because then you can do some research. You can see things about this guy's history. You can see where he played in the minor leagues. You can have an idea of what it must have been like for him to go to Pittsburgh to play behind the great Honus Wagner. And then Wagner's not coming for spring training and he's not there at the beginning of the season. And wow, this is my chance to shine. And then Honus comes back and then you're on the bench again, right? But you can understand that, you can see it, and you can sort of feel it a little bit, but you're only going to feel it and understand it if you're looking at it through the simulation standpoint. If you're anybody else, if you're, a warmonger, if you're one of these statistics guys, you're going to look at him and say, he's puny, he's insignificant, we don't care about this kind of player, he's replacement level, right? I don't know what his WAR was, but he's either replacement level or right below it, right? Pretty obvious, right? I mean, it's 1908, so if you're a statistician, most of these statisticians are like, it's before 1920, I don't even touch it, right? That's another issue. We've talked about that before. We'll talk about that again later, right? But if you're playing a replay and you're really getting into this and you're trying to understand how things really were and trying to learn more about the game, suddenly this becomes really interesting. And suddenly you're like, I want to know more about who Charlie Starr is, right? I want to know more about... Can't remember the dude's name. I wrote about him. The dude who was the worst pitcher in the 1902 Pirates, right? This guy who played like one season and who had an ERA of like 20 or whatever it was for one of the greatest teams of all time, right? I want to know more about this guy. And that really, for me, above all else, that is where these simulations and replays becomes really, really interesting. Look, any old fool can go write a biography of Honus Wagner or of Ty Cobb or of Babe Ruth or of all the other famous players, right? That's not too hard to do. But to like understand and research and learn about these guys who like even, you know, like the Saber biography people haven't gotten to yet, right? That's the thing that's really cool, to be sort of on the cutting edge of finding out about these guys, learning about them, understanding them, and having them be part of your game. That's the sort of thing that really only comes through replays. So for me, at least, that's the reason why I find myself so attracted to baseball simulations and why I play replays, why I have this channel, why I have the blog, and why I'm talking and, you know, sort of wandering off the subject while I talk with you about that. Anyway, there you have it. If you're like me, if you're into these games, let me know down below what it is that you like about them, what's the attraction, and we can compare notes. Talk to you later. Bye.